Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a bit unique, actually quite special.
That's right.
Our source material is a really insightful blog post written by you, the listener, Dr. Benjamin.
Yes, the post EP Sai Hokuro go up.
Yes, exactly. Systems thinking between attitude and strategy. It explores how systems thinking can, well, help us overcome that feeling of helplessness.
Right. And our plan for this deep dive is really to walk through the key ideas you laid out in your post.
We want to understand the framework you built, explore the concepts, and see how you connect all this to finding agency, when things feel complex.
We're essentially diving deep into your own analysis, exploring the English expressions and concepts you used.
You start by capturing a feeling that's pretty familiar, I think, for many people. Looking at these big, complex systems, economy, society, even just a large organization, it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, you use that great phrase like being a small boat in a big wave.
Right. And that leads straight to that thought, doesn't it? That paralyzing thought, well, I can't change anything anyway.
And it's completely understandable. Systems are huge. They feel powerful.
Our own individual impact can seem, well, tiny compared to that wave.
But then you introduce this core insight from systems thinking, which is crucial.
Dawn.
That while the system, the structure, definitely shapes us, there's also this truth, maybe uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You are part of that structure too.
Oh, okay. So it's not just happening to us.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not just a one-way thing. It's dynamic.
Right.
The system influences us, sure, but we also, collectively at least, influence the system.
Okay, so if feeling helpless is the trap, your post offers a strategy using systems thinking to maybe navigate out of it.
That's the goal, yeah.
So where do we start unpacking that strategy presented in your post?
Well, you begin by drawing a really key distinction
Okay.
between systems themselves and our attitude. Systems, you argue, can often be seen as value neutral. They just operate.
Based on their rules, their connections.
Right. But attitude, as you point out, is absolutely not value neutral. It's deeply personal.
And you bring in that incredibly powerful quote from Viktor Frankl about choosing your attitude.
From man's search for meaning, yeah. Even when you can't change the situation causing suffering, you can choose how you respond to it internally.
It's such a profound point about inner freedom.
It is, but, and this is important, you raise a dilemma if we just stop there. If we only focus on attitude.
What's the risk?
Well, if you're facing real systemic problems, things baked into the structure, and the only advice is change your attitude.
It puts all the burden back on the individual.
Yeah, right, unfairly.
Exactly. It can feel like blaming the victim sometimes.
And this leads you to discuss Julian Rotter's concept, internal locus of control, from the 60s.
Right. The idea that people believe their own actions determine their results. Personal effort leads to outcomes.
It's about personal agency being the main driver.
Yes. But you argue, quite compellingly, I think, that when you hit real, concrete, systemic barriers like rigid hierarchies or major economic divides.
Yeah. Just having a strong internal locus of control or a positive attitude might not be enough. You can't just will your way through a structural wall.
So attitude is vital, but not the whole picture when dealing with systems.
Precisely. That leads to your core argument.
Yeah.
You need strategy, something beyond just attitude.
And you propose a framework for understanding system change based on 3 dimensions.
Yes. I found it useful to think in terms of mental models, structure, and attitude.
Okay, mental models, structure, attitude. And you suggest a kind of hierarchy.
Sort of. Mental models are maybe the most fundamental, the deepest layer. They influence everything, but they're also the hardest to change.
Right. Then structure, which is where strategy really comes in.
And finally, attitude, which is our immediate response, moment to moment within the situation.
Okay, let's dig into that first one. Mental models. How did you define that in the post?
I tried to simplify it as what you take for granted. It's our basic lens on the world.
Like our core values, our beliefs, our whole worldview.
Exactly. The fundamental assumptions that shape how we see everything.
And why is changing that described as so fundamental, but also so incredibly difficult? You called it an all-out war on the entire range of thinking activities.
Yeah, maybe a bit dramatic, but it feels like that sometimes. Because these assumptions are so deep, they define what seems possible, what seems logical.
So changing them isn't just like changing a habit.
Not at all. It's a fundamental shift in perceiving reality. You mentioned it requires philosophical, maybe even ontological change, altering our basic grasp of how things are.
You give some great examples, like shifting from a purely growth-focused economic model to a circular economy one.
Or thinking about competition versus cooperation.
Right. If your mental model just assumes competition is natural and best,
Then cooperation might look weak or inefficient, but flip that model. Assume interdependence is key.
and suddenly intense competition might seem wasteful, even destructive.
It just shows how deeply these models shape everything else.
Okay, so given how tough changing mental models is, you suggest focusing strategy more on the structure dimension, specifically feedback loops.
Yeah, feedback is like the engine of how systems behave over time. It's how actions loop back to influence future actions.
And you focus on two main types in your post.
That's right. Reinforcing feedback and balancing feedback.
Okay, let's take reinforcing feedback first. You use that classic image, the snowball rolling downhill.
Exactly. Small changes amplify. The result of an action feeds back to create more of that same action. It grows.
And your example of doubling something daily, starting with 1, ending with over 530 million in a month, that really shows the power.
It illustrates that exponential growth curve.
But the key insight you pulled from that wasn't just the final huge number, it was when the growth happens.
Yes, that's so important. On day 29, after almost the entire period, you're still only at half the final amount.
Half the total result appears on the very last day.
Which explains why change driven by reinforcing loops can feel so slow, almost invisible for such a long time.
You're putting in the effort, doing the right things, but the results look tiny.
And then suddenly, whoosh, very rapid growth seems to come out of nowhere. But it was building all along.
And you point out this is value neutral, right? Could be good growth, could be a disaster escalating.
Absolutely. The pattern itself doesn't have a moral compass.
So if we want to use this constructively, how do we do it? You mentioned two conditions.
First, you obviously need the structure itself. The loop has to exist where a small effort leads to a result that enables or motivates more effort.
Okay, find the loop.
Second, and this is often the tricky part, is sustainability. You need the ability to keep that loop going over that long, slow initial period.
When you're not seeing the big results yet, that's where the helplessness can really bite.
Totally. So sustaining it is key.
How do you suggest we find these loops and then sustain them?
Well, finding them often requires maybe a certain belief in potential,
Mm-hmm.
seeing that small things can connect and grow. You mentioned looking at examples like cooperatives.
Right, where collective small efforts achieve something big. That builds belief.
And for sustaining it, especially through that slow phase, you talked about making it feel like play or keeping the excitement, the Noel you mentioned.
Ah, so it shouldn't feel like a grim duty.
Preferably not. If it's engaging, maybe even fun, you're more likely to stick with it. You connected this to resilience.
Okay, so the strategy for reinforcing feedback is 1, find that often hidden small loop. 2, create conditions to sustain it over the long haul, making it engaging, like play.
Start small, stay consistent, make it sustainable. That's the essence.
All right, let's switch to the other type, balancing feedback. How does that one work?
So if reinforcing feedback drives change away from a starting point, like growth, balancing feedback works to bring things towards a goal or equilibrium.
It tries to reduce a gap.
Exactly. The gap between where things are now and where you want them to be, the desired state. It seeks stability.
And you highlighted two crucial steps or challenges when working with these balancing loops.
Yeah, the first one is just recognizing the gap clearly. You need that cold, rational assessment. What's the goal level? What's the current reality level?
That difference is the problem you're trying to solve.
Right. It defines the need for action. The second step, or challenge, is dealing with delay.
Delay. The fact that your actions don't always produce immediate results. Why is understanding this so critical?
Because that time lag, that delay between action and effect, is a major source of frustration and, well, helplessness.
You act to close the gap, maybe you push hard, but nothing seems to change right away.
And that's where you said two negative things can happen. One, you just despair and give up. It's not working.
Yeah. Or 2, you compromise. You lower your goal because you're not seeing progress towards the original one.
Right. You settle for less because the delay makes it seem unachievable.
You also briefly touched on overshoot here, like in farming cycles or housing bubbles.
Yeah, that can happen when people don't account for the delay. They keep pushing, building more houses, planting more onions because they don't see the results of earlier efforts yet. But then suddenly there's way too much.
But the main point for overcoming helplessness was about accepting the delay.
Yes. Understanding that delay is a normal part of how systems work is fundamental. It requires patience, or what you call leisure.
So when you act towards a goal and don't see immediate results,
Instead of panicking or quitting, you understand there's likely a delay. You can then calmly assess, maybe try another strategy, knowing the first one might still be working its way through the system.
Okay. So for balancing feedback, the strategy involves clear, rational recognition of the gap, and then the patience and understanding to persist through the inherent delays.
Cold rationality for the gap, warm patience for the delay, something like that.
So putting it all together, understanding the deep mental models, using strategies based on reinforcing and balancing feedback loops, and managing our attitude, this integrated approach is your answer to helplessness.
That's what I argued in the post, yes. Because focusing on just one dimension isn't enough.
Right. Attitude alone blames the individual.
Strategy or structure alone can become robotic, inhuman, without guiding values.
And mental models alone can be too idealistic, detached from
You
action.
need all three working together.
You even quickly mentioned things like the fishery game or Nash equilibrium.
Just as examples of how the structure of a situation, the rules of the game, can really drive behavior and outcomes, sometimes more than individual intention or strategy alone. It reinforces why looking at structure is so vital.
Okay. So as you wrap up in the post, the core message isn't that systems thinking shows us we're powerless. It's the opposite.
Exactly. It's about understanding the dynamics so that we can see where the levers are where action is possible. It actually opens up more choices.
You brought in Heidegger's idea, being thrown into existence.
Yeah, that idea that we find ourselves in situations, in systems that we didn't necessarily choose,
But even though we're thrown in,
we still have the capacity, as you put it, to design the possibilities of our own existence within that context.
and connecting that back to your framework,
Hmm,
the system is the thrown condition.
right. But within it, we can plan, we can design our path.
And that design process starts with understanding our mental models
Develops through strategies that engage with the structure via feedback.
and is lived out moment to moment through our chosen attitude.
That's the synthesis, yes.
So your argument, Dr. Benjamin, is that while systems can seem paralyzing at first glance,
Systems thinking actually gives us deeper agency. It provides a map and tools for meaningful action.
it moves us beyond just feeling like that small boat in the giant wave.
Hopefully, yes. It helps us see ourselves not just as subject to the system, but as participants who can potentially shape it.
Well, this has been a really fantastic deep dive into your blog post. It lays out such a clear and compelling framework for tackling that feeling of helplessness by understanding these different dimensions.
It provides a way to think about where to intervene. Is it attitude, strategy, or the deeper mental models?
So to wrap up our exploration of your work, we'll leave everyone, and especially you, Dr. Benjamin, with those powerful reflective questions you posed at the end of your post.
Questions to consider. What system are you currently in? What is the dominant mental model you're operating with?
And crucially, what strategy and what attitude are you choosing to adopt within that system based on that understanding?
Thank you again, Dr. Benjamin, for providing such rich source material for our discussion today. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.